We all know what it feels like to be judged by how we look. Clara Mayfield knew that pain better than most. Standing on the auction block in Red Hollow, she watched the crowd whisper and point. Her father's debts had made her nothing more than property to be sold. Then Wyatt Callahan stepped forward, the biggest cowboy anyone had ever seen. 6'4", with hands like anvils. Everyone expected him to bid gold. Instead, he threw his old leather boots on the table. "That's my offer," he said. The crowd laughed, but Wyatt looked straight at Clara with eyes that saw something nobody else did. That moment changed everything. What the town didn't know was why the most feared man in 3 counties would give up his boots for a girl nobody wanted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Red Hollow wasn't the kind of town that forgave weakness. Built around a single dusty main street that stretched between the saloon on one end and the church on the other, it survived on cattle drives, silver prospects, and the unforgiving code that a person's worth could be measured at first glance. The wooden buildings leaned against each other like tired old men, their paint peeling under the relentless prairie sun, while the wind carried the perpetual scent of dust, horse sweat, and broken dreams. Clara Mayfield had learned this truth long before her 19th birthday. Every morning when she walked to the general store for supplies, the whispers followed her like tumbleweeds. Poor thing, the women would murmur from their porches, fanning themselves with whatever was handy. Plain as prairie grass and twice as common. The men were less kind, their eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible, or worse, something to pity. She had grown accustomed to pulling her worn shawl tight around her shoulders, keeping her head down and pretending not to hear. But Clara heard everything. She heard Mrs. Henderson tell her daughter to stand up straighter unless she wanted to end up looking like that Mayfield girl. She heard the banker's wife comment that some flowers just weren't meant to bloom. She heard the schoolteacher wonder aloud why the Lord made some people to be examples of what others shouldn't become. The cruelest part was that Clara remembered when things had been different. Before her mother died of the fever, when Clara was 12, their small house had been filled with laughter and the scent of fresh bread. Sarah Mayfield had possessed a gentle beauty that turned heads and softened hearts, and she had loved her plain daughter with a fierce tenderness that made Clara feel precious. Hidden beneath Clara's faded brown dress, pressed against her heart, lay her mother's silver locket. It was the only beautiful thing Clara owned, though she never dared wear it openly. The delicate engravings caught what little light filtered through the thin fabric, and sometimes Clara would touch it through her dress when the whispers grew too loud, remembering her mother's voice. "Beauty isn't what people see on the outside, my darling. It's what lives in here." Her mother had placed a gentle hand over Clara's heart. "And you have more beauty there than this whole town could ever understand." But after the fever took Sarah Mayfield, Clara's father had begun his slow descent into the bottom of whiskey bottles and card games. Thomas Mayfield had once been a capable blacksmith, with steady hands and an honest reputation. Grief had turned those steady hands to trembling ones, and his honest heart had grown desperate enough to gamble with money he didn't have. Clara had tried to hold their small world together. She took in mending, sold her mother's preserves, and stretched their meager supplies until each meal became an exercise in hope over substance. She watched her father stumble home from the saloon night after night, his eyes hollow with self-loathing, and she forgave him again and again because he was all she had left. The townspeople noticed Thomas Mayfield's decline, but they noticed Clara's poverty more. Her dresses grew more patched and faded with each passing month. Her shoes developed holes that she covered with carefully cut pieces of leather. Her hair, which might have been pretty if properly cared for, hung limp and dull from too much washing with harsh soap and too little proper nutrition. "That girl's going to end up in the poorhouse." Clara had overheard the preacher's wife say to the milliner, or worse, if you ask me, "A father like that, drinking away what little they have." Clara had learned to make herself small, to move through the town like a shadow, to speak only when spoken to, and then in the softest voice possible. She had accepted that her life would be one of invisibility and want, that she would grow old, taking care of her broken father until he drank himself to death, and then she would face the world completely alone. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, where the prairie stretched endless and golden toward the mountains, Wyatt Callahan lived a different kind of solitude. His ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. The Callahan spread was known from Denver to Santa Fe for producing the strongest horses and the best cattle. Men rode for days just to buy breeding stock from Wyatt Callahan, and they paid in gold without question because his reputation was as solid as the mountains themselves. But Wyatt was not a man who courted company or conversation. At 32, he stood 6'4" in his stocking feet, with shoulders broad enough to yoke oxen and hands that could gentle the wildest mustang or break a man's jaw with equal ease. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his grey eyes had the unsettling quality of seeing more than most people wanted to reveal. He wore his solitude like armor, speaking only when necessary and trusting fewer people than he had fingers on one hand. The townspeople of Red Hollow respected Wyatt Callahan's money and feared his reputation, but they didn't understand him. He had built his ranch from nothing after the war, working 18-hour days and sleeping under stars until he could afford to put up a cabin. That cabin had grown into a sprawling house with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light, but Wyatt had filled it with silence instead of family. There had been a wife once, Rebecca, a delicate beauty from back east who had married him in a fever of romantic notions about taming the frontier alongside her strong husband. She had died, giving birth to their stillborn son 3 winters past, and since then Wyatt had spoken to God about as often as he spoke to his neighbors, which was hardly at all. His ranch hands were loyal men who had learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the length of his silences. They respected his privacy and his pain, knowing that some wounds ran too deep for words to heal. But they also knew their boss was fair, paid well, and never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Old Pete, his foreman, had ridden with Wyatt since the early days and was probably the closest thing to a friend the rancher had left. Even Pete knew better than to push when Wyatt's eyes got that distant look, when he would spend entire evenings on his porch, staring out at the endless grassland, as if waiting for something that would never come. The tragedy was that neither Clara nor Wyatt knew how much they had in common. Both had learned that life could strip away everything you loved without warning. Both had accepted loneliness as the price of surviving in a world that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Both had built walls around their hearts, Clara's made of resigned invisibility, Wyatt's constructed from deliberate isolation. But walls, no matter how carefully built, sometimes develop cracks. The beginning of the end of Clara's invisible life started on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Sheriff Morrison knocked on their door with papers in his hand and pity in his eyes. Clara had been mending a tear in her father's only good shirt, trying to make the patch invisible so he might have a chance at finding work, when the knock came. "Miss Mayfield," the sheriff said, removing his hat respectfully, "I'm here about your father's debts." Clara's needle stilled in her hand. She had known this day was coming, had seen it approaching like a storm on the horizon. But knowledge didn't make the lightning strike any less painful. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Morrison consulted his papers, though Clara suspected he had memorized the numbers long ago. $300 to Morrison's saloon, $200 to the general store, $150 to Doc Williams, and $400 to Blackjack Murphy for poker debts. He paused, his weathered face creasing with genuine sympathy. "That's over $1,000, Miss Clara. Your father signed papers putting your house up as collateral, but the house ain't worth half what he owes." Clara set down her mending with hands that trembled only slightly. $1,000 might as well have been $1 million. She made perhaps $30 a month with her mending and preserves when she was lucky. What are my options, Sheriff? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Well, there's the poorhouse over in Millerville. Or... He trailed off, clearly reluctant to continue. Or what? Murphy says he'll forgive the debt if you work it off, but his kind of work... Morrison's jaw tightened. I wouldn't recommend that path to any decent woman. Clara understood perfectly. Blackjack Murphy owned the saloon and the women who worked upstairs. It was a life that would destroy what little remained of her soul. But it was still a life. How long do I have to decide? 3 days. Then Murphy's calling in the debt. And if you can't pay... He shrugged helplessly. There's going to be an auction, Miss Clara. Everything your family owns, including your father's bond of indenture for his debts. And since you're his dependent... He didn't need to finish the sentence. After Sheriff Morrison left, Clara sat in her empty house for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards and feeling the weight of her mother's locket against her heart. She thought about her options, which weren't really options at all. She thought about her father, passed out drunk behind the saloon, unaware that he had just sold his daughter's freedom along with his own dignity. She thought about her mother, who had believed there was beauty enough in Clara's heart to light up the world. She thought about a lot of things, but she never once imagined that in 3 days' time, a man she had never spoken to would change her life with a pair of old boots. The next morning, word of the auction spread through Red Hollow, faster than wildfire. By noon, every person in town knew that poor, plain Clara Mayfield would be standing on the block come Friday, her father's debts wrapped around her neck like a noose. The women clucked their tongues in sympathy while secretly feeling grateful that their own lives, however difficult, had never sunk to such depths. The men appraised this unexpected opportunity with the calculating eyes of livestock buyers at market. Clara spent those 3 days setting her affairs in order with the methodical calm of someone preparing for her own funeral. She cleaned the house until it sparkled, folded her few belongings into her mother's old carpet bag, and wrote a letter she would never send to the father who had traded her future for the bottom of a whiskey glass. On Thursday night, she sat on her small front porch for the last time, watching the sun set over the prairie and fingering the silver locket beneath her dress. Tomorrow she would stand before the people who had spent her entire life reminding her of her worthlessness, and they would bid on her as if she were a head of cattle or a broken-down horse. But tonight, with her mother's silver locket warm against her heart and the vast sky stretching endless above her, Clara Mayfield allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be loved. Friday morning dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Clara had not slept, but she had made peace with what was coming. She dressed in her least patched dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been her mother's, and braided her hair with hands that barely trembled. The silver locket lay against her heart, hidden but present, a small reminder that she had been loved once. The auction block stood in the center of Main Street like a wooden altar to human misery. Built originally for selling livestock, it had seen its share of human commerce over the years, mostly men working off debts or women with nowhere else to turn. The iron shackles bolted to its corners had been scrubbed clean for the occasion, but they still bore the rust stains of too many desperate stories. Sheriff Morrison had tried to arrive early to keep the crowd manageable, but by 9 o'clock, half the town had gathered. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others from the darker impulses that drew people to witness suffering. The men who intended to bid stood closer to the block, their faces wearing the calculated expressions of buyers examining merchandise. Blackjack Murphy held court near the saloon steps, his gold teeth catching the morning light as he smiled at his own cleverness. At 53, Murphy had made his fortune understanding human weakness and exploiting it with the precision of a surgeon. He wore a black suit that had cost more than most families saw in a year, and his pale eyes assessed the gathering crowd with satisfaction. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. "We're here to settle a debt, fair and square. Thomas Mayfield owes money all over town, and his daughter's willing to work it off, honest." The way he said honest made several women pull their shawls tighter around their shoulders. Dr. Patterson, a weathered man in his 60s who had delivered half the babies in Red Hollow, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Murphy, this isn't right. The girl's done nothing wrong." "Debt's debt, Doc. Her father signed the papers legal." Murphy's smile never wavered. "Besides, I'm offering her a position with room and board, more than most folks in her situation could hope for." Everyone knew what kind of position Murphy was offering, but no one had the courage to say it aloud. In Red Hollow, a woman without family or prospects had precious few choices, and all of them led to some form of servitude. Clara appeared at exactly 10 o'clock, walking down Main Street with her chin up and her small carpet bag in her hand. She had chosen dignity over speed, moving with the measured pace of someone who refused to run toward her own destruction. The crowd fell silent as she approached, and she could feel their eyes cataloguing every flaw, every visible sign of her poverty and plainness. She climbed the 3 wooden steps to the auction block without assistance, her mother's words echoing in her memory. "Walk like you know your own worth, Clara. Never let them see you crawl." The auctioneer, a nervous man named Perkins, who usually sold cattle and farm equipment, fumbled with his papers as if he had never seen them before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Perkins began, his voice cracking slightly, "we're here to settle the debts of Thomas Mayfield through the bond of indenture of his daughter, Clara Mayfield." He cleared his throat. "Miss Mayfield is 19 years old, healthy and capable of household duties, cooking, mending, and general labor." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, while Perkins droned through the legal formalities. She felt strangely disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching this happen to someone else from very far away. "We'll start the bidding at $50, Perkins announced. Murphy raised his hand immediately. "50. Doc Patterson, his face grim with distaste, countered. 75. He intended to bid just high enough to keep her away from Murphy, then find her honest work in his household. 100, called out Jake Morrison, the blacksmith's son, who had been drinking since dawn to work up the courage. His intentions were hardly noble, but they were better than Murphy's. 150, Murphy's voice cut through the air with casual confidence. He knew exactly how high these men could afford to go, and his resources far exceeded theirs. Clara watched the numbers climb with detached interest, the way she might observe the price of grain at harvest time. These men were not bidding on her dreams or her potential or the kindness her mother had nurtured in her heart. They were purchasing her labor, her obedience, and her silence. Doc Patterson made one more attempt at decency. 200. Murphy's laugh was soft and predatory. 300, and that's more than generous for what's on offer. The crowd stirred uneasily. $300 was serious money, more than most men saw in 6 months. Doc Patterson's shoulders sagged with defeat. He simply could not match Murphy's resources, and everyone knew it. "Going once," Perkins called out, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. "Going twice." That was when the crowd parted like water before the prow of a ship. Wyatt Callahan rode down Main Street on his black stallion, Ghost, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. But there was something different about him today, an intensity in his posture, a purpose in the set of his jaw that made people step back instinctively. Wyatt had heard about the auction the night before, when old Pete mentioned it during their evening discussion of ranch business. Something about the casual way Pete had delivered the news, poor Mayfield girls getting sold tomorrow to cover her daddy's debts, had lodged in Wyatt's chest like a splinter. He had spent the night walking the perimeter of his ranch, trying to understand why this particular injustice bothered him more than the dozen others he witnessed every month in Red Hollow. Now, Looking up at Clara standing on that block with her chin raised and her dignity intact despite everything, he understood. She stood the way his Rebecca had stood when facing difficulty with quiet courage that most people mistook for resignation. But Wyatt recognized the difference. Resignation was surrender. What he saw in Clara Mayfield's bearing was endurance. He dismounted Ghost with fluid motion and walked toward the auction block, his boots striking the hard-packed earth with purpose. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but unable to guess what form it would take. Wyatt Callahan was not a man given to grand gestures or public displays. In the 3 years since Rebecca's death, he had spoken at exactly 2 town meetings, attended 1 funeral, and participated in 0 social gatherings. His appearance at the auction was as unexpected as a thunderstorm in winter. "What's the current bid?" His voice carried easily across the square, though he spoke quietly. Perkins stammered, "The $300, Mr. Callahan, from Mr. Murphy." Wyatt's grey eyes found Clara's face, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Clara saw something in his expression that she had never seen in any man's eyes when he looked at her, not pity, not calculation, not disgust. She could not identify what it was, but it made her feel less alone than she had in years. Without breaking eye contact with Clara, Wyatt reached down and began unlacing his boots. They were good boots, hand-tooled leather that had served him faithfully for 5 years. They were broken in perfectly to his feet, comfortable as old friends, and worth at least $40 to the right buyer. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Wyatt pulled off his boots and walked barefoot to the auction block. He set them down on the wooden platform with the same care he might use to place flowers on a grave. "That's my bid," he said simply. The silence stretched so long that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Then Murphy's laughter shattered the quiet, like glass hitting stone. "You can't be serious, Callahan. Those old boots against 300 in gold?" Wyatt turned to face Murphy with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. "I'm completely serious. Those boots have walked every mile of the best ranch in 3 counties. They've stood in mud and blood and snow, and they've never let me down. I figure that's worth more than Murphy's gold, considering what he plans to do with what he's buying." The implications of his words rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Everyone understood exactly what Wyatt was saying about Murphy's intentions, and everyone understood that Wyatt Callahan had just called out the most dangerous man in Red Hollow. Murphy's face darkened. "This is a legal auction, Callahan. You can't bid livestock gear against real money." "Perkins," Wyatt said, never taking his eyes off Murphy, "is there anything in the legal documents that specifies the form payment must take?" The auctioneer shuffled through his papers with trembling hands. "Well, no, sir. It just says settlement of debt through fair compensation." "Then my boots are fair compensation. Any man here will tell you they're worth good money, and more than that, they represent honest work and honest miles." Wyatt's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the quiet words. "Question is whether this town values honest work or dirty gold." Clara found herself holding her breath. She understood that something much larger than her own fate was being decided in this moment. The entire social order of Red Hollow hung in the balance between Murphy's money and Wyatt's boots, between the power of gold and the strength of principle. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, sensing the potential for violence. "Now, gentlemen, let's keep this civil." But Wyatt was already turning back to Clara, dismissing Murphy as if he were no more threatening than a troublesome fly. "Miss Mayfield," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "If you come with me, you'll have your own room, your own space, and your own choices. You'll work if you want to work, rest if you need to rest, and leave any time you decide you'd rather be somewhere else. That's my offer." Clara stared down at this man who had just offered her something she had never expected to receive from anyone. Respect. Not rescue, not charity, but simple human respect offered freely with no conditions attached. Going once, Perkins called out, his voice stronger now. Perhaps witnessing one act of courage had reminded him what decency looked like. Murphy started to protest, but Wyatt's hand moved to rest casually on the handle of his gun, and Murphy decided that $300 wasn't worth testing the speed of the fastest draw in the territory. Going twice. Clara looked down at Wyatt's boots, sitting on the platform beside her feet. They were worn and scuffed, but they had been cared for. Like everything else about Wyatt Callahan, they spoke of quiet strength and steady reliability. Sold, Perkins announced, to Wyatt Callahan for one pair of boots and the promise of honest treatment. The crowd erupted in murmurs and whispers, but Clara barely heard them. Wyatt was climbing the steps to the platform, and when he reached her, he held out his hand. "Miss Clara," he said, "if you're ready, I'd like to take you home." She placed her small, work-roughened hand in his large, calloused one, and felt something she had never expected to feel again: hope. The ride to Wyatt's ranch passed in a silence that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Clara sat behind him on Ghost, her small hands gripping the saddle rather than Wyatt's waist, maintaining a careful distance even as she trusted him to carry her toward whatever came next. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, golden grass rippling in waves beneath the vast sky, and for the first time in years, Clara felt small in a way that brought peace rather than shame. Wyatt's ranch appeared gradually, like a promise being kept by the landscape itself. First came the fence lines, sturdy posts and rails that spoke of careful planning and honest work. Then the pastures, where cattle grazed in contentment and horses lifted their heads to watch the riders pass. Finally, the buildings came into view, a sprawling house with a wide porch, several barns built to last generations, and outbuildings arranged with the kind of thoughtful precision that only came from years of patient effort. The ranch gate stood open, welcoming but substantial, with a wooden sign that read, "Callahan Ranch, Est, 1871, carved in letters that had weathered many seasons but remained proud and clear. Clara found herself staring at those words as they passed beneath the sign. Established 1871. This place had roots, history, permanence, things she had never known in her own life. "Built it myself," Wyatt said quietly, the first words he had spoken since they left town. "Started with nothing but a dream and a stubborn streak wider than the prairie." Clara wanted to respond, to ask questions about how one person could create something so substantial from nothing, but her throat felt tight with emotion she couldn't name. Everything about this place spoke of stability and care. The fences were mended, the buildings were painted, and even the dirt in the yard was swept clean. This was what a home looked like when someone took pride in it. 3 men emerged from the main barn as they approached the house, their movements casual but alert. Clara tensed instinctively, her limited experience with men teaching her to expect trouble when outnumbered. But Wyatt's voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard before. "Pete, Charlie, Santos, come meet Miss Clara." The oldest of the 3, a grizzled man with silver threading his brown hair and eyes the color of winter sky, stepped forward first. He removed his hat with old-fashioned courtesy and inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man who had learned to treat all women as ladies, regardless of their circumstances. "I'm Pete Donovan, foreman of this outfit. These fellows are Charlie Webb and Santos Moreno." The other 2 men nodded politely, their faces open and friendly without being presumptuous. Clara managed a small smile. "Pleased to meet you." "Pete's been with me since the beginning," Wyatt explained, as he dismounted and reached up to help Clara down. "Charlie handles the horses, and Santos knows more about cattle than any 3 men should. Between them, they keep this place running while I pretend to be in charge." The gentle humor in his voice surprised Clara. She had expected the man who had faced down Blackjack Murphy to be harder, more intimidating, but here, among his own people, Wyatt revealed a different side of himself. His hands were steady and careful as he helped her from the horse, and he released her immediately once her feet touched the ground, making no attempt to prolong the contact. "Charlie, would you see to Ghost? And Santos, could you ask Maria to prepare the blue room?" Wyatt turned to Clara. "Maria Moreno is Santos's wife. She helps keep the house running and cooks better than anyone has a right to. You'll like her." Clara nodded, overwhelmed by the casual way these people moved around each other, the easy respect and genuine affection that seasoned their interactions. She had never seen men work together without posturing or cruelty, had never witnessed the kind of mutual regard that seemed to flow naturally between Wyatt and his hands. "Come on," Wyatt said gently. "Let me show you the house." The front porch wrapped around 3 sides of the building, wide enough for chairs and tables, with carved railings that spoke of someone's care for beauty as well as function. The front door was solid oak, fitted with brass hinges that gleamed in the afternoon light. When Wyatt opened it and gestured for Clara to enter first, she stepped into a world she had only imagined. The main room was spacious but welcoming, with a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space and windows that brought the prairie light inside. The furniture was well made and comfortable, not fancy, but built to last and chosen by someone who understood the difference between luxury and quality. Native blankets added color to the neutral walls, and books lined shelves built into alcoves beside the fireplace. "Rebecca chose most of the furnishings," Wyatt said quietly, following Clara's gaze around the room. She had good taste. The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them, not uncomfortable but acknowledged. Clara understood instinctively that this house held memories, some joyful and some painful, and she was being trusted to move carefully among them. A small, energetic woman with graying black hair and kind eyes appeared from what Clara assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on a spotless apron. "You must be Miss Clara," she said warmly, her slight accent adding music to the words. "I am Maria Moreno. Welcome to our home." Our home. Not Wyatt's home or the ranch house, but our home. Clara felt her throat tighten again at the casual inclusion, the assumption that she belonged here simply because Wyatt had brought her. "Maria, could you show Miss Clara to the blue room, and perhaps help her get settled?" Wyatt's request was phrased as such, but Clara heard the underlying concern. He was giving her space, time to adjust, and a woman's company to ease the transition. "Of course," Maria beamed. "Come, Clara. May I call you Clara? Good. Let me show you your room, and then we will have tea and talk." Clara followed Maria up a staircase, built from the same oak as the front door, her hand trailing along a banister worn smooth by years of use. The upstairs hallway was lined with windows that looked out over the ranch, and Clara caught glimpses of the working life below, men moving cattle, horses grazing in nearby pastures, and the endless sky stretching toward distant mountains. The blue room was at the front of the house, with windows facing both east and south to catch the morning light and afternoon sun. The walls were painted a soft blue-gray that reminded Clara of dawn skies, and the furniture was simple but elegant, a bed with a quilted coverlet, a dresser with a mirror, a small table and chair positioned to take advantage of the light from the windows. But what took Clara's breath away was the privacy. This was her room. Not a corner of a shared space, not a pallet on a kitchen floor, but an entire room that belonged to her alone. She could close the door and be completely by herself, could arrange her few possessions however she chose, could think her own thoughts without anyone watching or judging. "The washstand has fresh water," Maria said, indicating a corner of the room where a china pitcher and bowl sat on a small table. "There are extra blankets in the chest, and if you need anything at all, you just ask." Wyatt said, "You are to be comfortable here." Clara set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to Maria, struggling to find words adequate to express what she was feeling. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why is he being so kind to me?" Maria's expression grew thoughtful. "Wyatt is a good man who has carried much pain. Perhaps he recognizes pain in others and wishes to ease it where he can." She paused, studying Clara's face. "You have been hurt, I think. People have not been kind to you." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then you understand something about suffering, and that is valuable knowledge. Wyatt lost his wife 3 years ago. She died bringing their child into the world, and the baby died with her. Since then, he has been very alone, even with all of us around him." Maria moved to the window and looked out over the ranch. "Maybe you can help each other find some peace." The simplicity of Maria's words hit Clara with unexpected force. She had spent so long thinking of herself as a burden, a problem to be solved or endured, that the idea of being helpful to someone else seemed revolutionary. "I don't know how to be anything but what I've always been," Clara admitted. Maria smiled. "And what have you always been?" "Poor, plain, forgettable." The words came out more honestly than Clara had intended. "Ah," Maria said softly, "and what did your mother tell you about yourself?" Clara's hand moved instinctively to the silver locket beneath her dress. "She said, I had beauty in my heart, but I don't think that's the kind of beauty that matters to most people." "Most people are fools," Maria said matter-of-factly. "Beauty that lives in the heart is the only kind that lasts. The other kind fades with time and trouble, but kindness, courage, loyalty, these things grow stronger with age." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Rest for a while, Clara. Tonight we will eat together as a family, and you will begin to see that you are not the same person who stood on that auction block this morning. That person was trapped by other people's debts and other people's cruelty. This person, the one standing in her own room, in a house where she is welcome, this person can become anyone she chooses to be." After Maria left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her room. Her room. She touched the quilted coverlet, ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the dresser, and stood at the window, watching the men work below. Everything felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. She unpacked her few belongings slowly, giving each item careful consideration before deciding where it belonged. Her mother's recipe book went on the small table by the window. Her extra dress and few undergarments went in the dresser drawers that smelled faintly of lavender. Her mother's silver locket she lifted from beneath her dress and held in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. For the first time in 7 years, Clara fastened the delicate chain around her neck and let the locket rest openly against her dress. In this house, in this room, surrounded by kindness she had never expected to receive, she could finally wear the one beautiful thing her mother had left her. The silver caught the light and threw tiny rainbows against the blue walls, and Clara Mayfield began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might have a future worth living after all. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through her windows and the unfamiliar sound of her own peaceful breathing. For the first time in years, she had slept through the entire night without waking to check on her father, or worry about debts, or wonder if she would have enough food for tomorrow. The luxury of uninterrupted rest felt almost decadent. A soft knock at her door brought her fully awake. "Clara?" Maria's voice carried gentle concern. "I have brought you something to wear today, if you would like." Clara opened the door to find Maria holding a dress of soft blue calico, simply cut but well made, with tiny white flowers scattered across the fabric like stars against a summer sky. The dress was modest but pretty, the kind of garment Clara had never owned but had always admired from a distance. "I made this for Rebecca," Maria explained, "but she never had the chance to wear it. I think you are about the same size, and the color will be lovely with your eyes." Clara's hands trembled as she touched the soft fabric. "I couldn't. It was hers. And now she is gone, and you are here," Maria said with gentle firmness. "Rebecca would want her things to bring joy, not gather dust. Besides," she smiled, "Wyatt asked me to make sure you had everything you needed to feel at home. I think this dress will help." The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for Clara's slender frame. The blue brought out the color in her eyes, and the simple cut flattered her figure without being bold. When Clara looked at herself in the dresser mirror, she saw a different person than the one who had stood on the auction block yesterday, not transformed, Exactly, but revealed. This was what she might have looked like all along if poverty and shame hadn't taught her to hide. Breakfast was served in the kitchen, a cheerful room with yellow walls and windows that looked out over Maria's herb garden. Wyatt sat at the head of a long wooden table, drinking coffee and reading what appeared to be a letter. He looked up when Clara entered, and she saw something shift in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Good morning, Miss Clara. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Clara admitted, taking the seat Maria indicated. "Thank you." The simple exchange felt monumental to Clara, who had grown accustomed to starting each day with anxiety about what problems it might bring. Here, the morning held only gentle conversation and the scent of fresh biscuits. "I thought today I might show you around the ranch," Wyatt said, folding his letter carefully. "Help you get acquainted with how things work here, if you're interested, that is." Clara nodded eagerly. She had never seen a working ranch up close, had never understood how the vast machinery of cattle and horses and endless land could be managed by human hands and hearts. They began with the stables, where Charlie Webb was working with a young colt that danced and snorted at the end of his lead rope. Clara had always been frightened of horses. They seemed too large, too unpredictable, but Charlie's calm patience with the animal was reassuring. "This one's got spirit," Charlie explained as the colt settled under his gentle handling. "But spirit's not the same as mean. You just have to show them you're not going to hurt them, and they'll work with you." Wyatt watched Clara observe the interaction between man and horse. "Would you like to try?" he asked. Clara's immediate instinct was to refuse. To step back and insist she couldn't possibly. But something in Wyatt's tone stopped her. He wasn't challenging her or testing her courage. He was simply offering her an opportunity to try something new. "I don't know anything about horses," she said uncertainly. "Neither did I when I started," Wyatt replied. "Charlie, would you bring out Sunshine? She's gentle as her name." Sunshine turned out to be a golden mare with kind eyes and a patient temperament. Under Wyatt's careful instruction, Clara learned to approach the horse slowly, to let Sunshine smell her hand before touching her neck, to speak in low, soothing tones that conveyed no threat. "She likes you," Charlie observed as Sunshine lowered her head to nuzzle Clara's shoulder. "Animals know when people have kind hearts." The simple compliment hit Clara unexpectedly hard. She had been told so often what she lacked: beauty, grace, social standing, that hearing someone identify a positive quality in her felt revolutionary. From the stables, they moved to the cattle pastures, where Santos was checking the health of the herd. Clara learned about breeding cycles and grazing rotation, about reading the signs that indicated whether animals were content or stressed. She watched Santos work with quiet competence, his movements economical and sure, and began to understand that running a ranch required not just physical strength, but deep knowledge accumulated over years of careful observation. "Santos came here from Mexico 10 years ago," Wyatt explained, as they walked between the pastures. "He knew more about cattle than I'll ever learn, and he's taught me most of what I know about managing a herd." Clara noticed the respect in Wyatt's voice, the way he spoke of his employees not as hired hands, but as partners in the enterprise. This was different from anything she had seen in Red Hollow, where social hierarchies were rigid and respect flowed only upward. "How do you remember it all?" she asked. "All the details, all the things that need to be done?" Wyatt smiled, and Clara realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. "You start with what matters most, keeping the animals healthy and safe. Everything else builds from there. And you don't try to do it alone. Pete knows things I don't. Santos sees things I miss. Charlie understands horses better than I understand people. Together, we make it work." They spent the morning moving through different parts of the ranch, and Clara began to see the intricate web of relationships and responsibilities that kept the place functioning. Each person had a role, each animal had needs, each section of land required different care. It was complex, but not chaotic, challenging, but not overwhelming. Around midday, they returned to the house, where Maria had prepared a lunch of fresh bread, cold beef, and vegetables from her garden. As they ate, Clara found herself asking questions about the ranch's history, about how Wyatt had built something so substantial from nothing. "Started with $100 and a bad horse," Wyatt said, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Worked for other ranchers during the day and spent my nights building the first cabin. Took me 3 years to buy my first cattle, another 2 to build the herd big enough to matter." "Weren't you afraid?" Clara asked. "Starting with so little, risking everything." Wyatt considered the question seriously. "Terrified," he admitted, "but being afraid of failing seemed less important than being afraid of never trying. And I had something to prove, I suppose." "To who?" "To myself, mostly. I came back from the war with nothing but scars and bad dreams, needed to know I could build something instead of just destroying things." The honesty in his answer made Clara's chest tight. She recognized the feeling he described, the need to prove you were worth something, that your life had meaning beyond the pain you had endured. That afternoon, Maria taught Clara how to make bread, her experienced hands guiding Clara's inexperienced ones through the rhythms of kneading and shaping. "Bread is honest," Maria explained as they worked. "You cannot hurry it or trick it. It responds to patience and care, and it feeds people you love. There is satisfaction in that." Clara found unexpected peace in the simple work. Her hands, which had always been busy with mending and cleaning and worry, felt purposeful in a different way as she shaped the dough and placed it in the oven to bake. The kitchen filled with warmth and the promise of nourishment, and Clara began to understand what Maria meant about satisfaction. As evening approached, the men returned from their day's work, and the house filled with the comfortable sounds of people settling into rest. Clara helped Maria prepare supper, feeling useful in a way that was entirely new to her. In her father's house, her work had been driven by desperation, cooking whatever scraps were available, mending clothes until they fell apart, stretching every resource beyond its limits. Here, her efforts contributed to abundance, rather than merely staving off disaster. Supper was served in the dining room, a warm space lit by oil lamps and filled with easy conversation. Pete told stories about the day's work, Charlie described the progress he was making with the young horses, and Santos shared news from his family in Mexico. Clara listened mostly, but when Wyatt asked her opinion about something Maria had taught her, she found herself contributing to the conversation without self-consciousness. "Clara made the bread tonight," Maria announced proudly. "Her first time, and it is perfect." The simple praise made Clara's cheeks warm, but she noticed that no one made a fuss or treated her accomplishment as surprising. They simply accepted that she was capable of learning and contributing, as if it had never occurred to them to think otherwise. After supper, Clara helped Maria clear the dishes, and the two women worked together in comfortable companionship. Through the kitchen window, Clara could see Wyatt sitting on the front porch, his chair tilted back against the wall as he watched the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. "He does that every evening," Maria said, following Clara's gaze. "Sits and watches the sky change. I think he talks to Rebecca sometimes, tells her about his day." Clara felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy but was more like longing. What would it be like to be remembered with such tenderness, to know that someone would carry your memory forward with love instead of resentment? "Did you know her well?" Clara asked. "Rebecca? Oh yes, she was like sunshine, always laughing, always finding something to be happy about. She loved this place as much as Wyatt did, maybe more. She used to say the prairie talked to her, told her secrets about growing things and weather and the rhythms of the seasons." Maria finished drying the last plate and hung up her towel. "She would have liked you, I think. Rebecca believed in seeing the best in people, in helping them become who they were meant to be." As Clara prepared for bed that night, she stood again at her window and watched Wyatt on the porch below. The blue calico dress hung carefully in the wardrobe, her wardrobe now, and the silver locket caught the lamplight as she prepared to remove it for sleep. But instead of hiding it away, Clara left the locket visible on her nightstand, where it would catch the morning light. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that she was worthy of the kindness she had been shown. For the first time in her life, Clara Mayfield fell asleep looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endless under a canopy of stars, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other across the vast, beautiful emptiness that no longer felt empty at all. 3 weeks into her new life, Clara discovered Wyatt's secret while organizing the study that adjoined his bedroom. Maria had asked her to dust the bookshelves and tidy the papers that seemed to accumulate there like autumn leaves, and Clara had approached the task with the same careful attention she brought to all her work at the ranch. The study was Wyatt's private space, filled with ledgers and maps and correspondence related to the business of running the ranch. Clara worked quietly, respectful of the personal nature of the room, until she noticed a small wooden box sitting open on the desk. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a simple gold wedding ring. Wyatt's father's wedding ring. Maria had mentioned it once in passing, saying that Wyatt had never been able to bring himself to wear it after Rebecca died. Now, Clara understood why. The ring represented not just love, but the terrible vulnerability that came with loving someone completely. The knowledge that happiness could be torn away without warning, leaving nothing but memories and an empty circle of gold. She was carefully closing the box when Wyatt's voice startled her from the doorway. "I keep meaning to put that away," he said quietly, though he made no move to take the box from her hands. Clara turned to face him, her heart racing at being caught in such an intimate moment. "I'm sorry, I wasn't prying. Maria asked me to tidy up, and it was just sitting there open." No need to apologize. Wyatt entered the room and took the box from her, his fingers careful as he touched the gold band. "It was my father's, and his father's before that. Rebecca used to say it was waiting for the right moment to matter again." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Clara heard it anyway. She had become skilled at recognizing hidden hurt, having carried so much of her own. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Clara said gently. She was, too wise to marry a stubborn rancher with more scars than sense, but she did it anyway. Wyatt closed the box with a soft click. "Sometimes I wonder what she saw in me that I couldn't see in myself." Clara looked at this man who had rescued her from public humiliation, who had given her dignity and purpose, and the first real home she had ever known, and wondered how he could possibly doubt his own worth. "Maybe she saw the same thing I see," Clara said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Wyatt's grey eyes found hers, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "And what's that?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Kindness. Strength that doesn't need to prove itself by hurting others. The ability to see value in things other people overlook. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Clara realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, her gratitude had transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. She was falling in love with Wyatt Callahan, and the knowledge terrified her. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house at speed. Wyatt moved to the window, his expression growing tense as he recognized the riders. "Stay inside," he told Clara, his voice carrying a new edge. "Lock the doors and find Maria." Through the window, Clara saw 3 men dismounting near the front porch. Even from a distance, she could see they were different from the respectful visitors who usually came to the ranch. These men moved with the aggressive swagger of people accustomed to taking what they wanted. Clara found Maria in the kitchen, and together they watched from behind curtains as Wyatt stepped onto the front porch to meet the visitors. Pete and Santos appeared from the direction of the barn, their movements casual but alert. "Who are they?" Clara whispered. "Trouble," Maria replied grimly. "I recognize the one in front, Jake Morrison, the blacksmith's son from town. The other 2 work for Murphy." Clara's blood went cold. She had hoped her connection to Blackjack Murphy had ended when Wyatt's boots hit the auction block, but apparently Murphy was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison talking animatedly, his gestures becoming more aggressive as Wyatt remained calm and unmoved. The conversation was too distant to hear, but its nature was clear from the body language of both men. "He's demanding something," Maria observed. "And Wyatt is telling him no." Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill. "This is my fault. They're here because of me." "No," Maria said firmly. "They are here because they are foolish men who think they can intimidate Wyatt Callahan on his own land. They will learn differently." The confrontation continued for several more minutes before Jake Morrison and his companions remounted their horses. As they rode away, Morrison shouted something over his shoulder that made Wyatt's shoulders tense, though his posture remained controlled. When Wyatt came back inside, his face was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "What did they want?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Morrison seems to think there was something irregular about the auction," Wyatt said carefully. "He suggested that Murphy might be willing to make a more generous offer for your services." The delicate way he phrased it didn't disguise the crude nature of the message. Clara sank into a kitchen chair, her newfound confidence crumbling under the weight of her past. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I should go somewhere Murphy can't find me. I won't bring trouble to your home. You're not going anywhere." Wyatt's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "This is your home now, and no one, not Murphy, not Morrison, not anyone, is going to change that." Maria nodded emphatically. "Besides, where would you go? Back to town where they wait for you? To another place where you know no one?" "No, Clara. You belong here." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her presence was putting everyone she cared about in danger. That evening, she barely touched her supper, and she excused herself early to walk alone in Maria's garden behind the house. The garden was Maria's pride, rows of vegetables and herbs, arranged with both practicality and beauty in mind. Clara found peace among the orderly plants, the careful balance of cultivation and nature that reminded her of the ranch itself, wild but tended, strong but gentle. She was examining Maria's prized tomatoes when Wyatt found her there. "Beautiful evening," he said, joining her beside the garden fence. "Yes," Clara agreed, though her mind was elsewhere. "Wyatt, I need you to know that I understand what my presence here might cost you. If Murphy decides to make real trouble—" "Clara." The quiet authority in his voice stopped her words. "Do you trust me?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of devastating loss. Clara had trusted her father, and he had sold her to pay his debts. She had trusted that hard work and good intentions would eventually be rewarded, and instead she had found herself on an auction block. But as she looked at Wyatt's steady grey eyes, at the patient strength he had shown her every day for 3 weeks, Clara realized that some risks were worth taking. "Yes," she said simply, "I trust you." "Then trust me when I tell you that this ranch is strong enough to weather whatever trouble Murphy thinks he can bring. Trust me when I say that you're safe here, that you belong here, and that I won't let anyone take you away." The conviction in his voice made Clara's throat tight with emotion. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the endless prairie beyond the garden. When he spoke, his words were careful but honest. "I spent 3 years believing that the best parts of my life were behind me. That all I could do was manage what was left, try to honor Rebecca's memory by keeping the ranch running and not causing too much harm to anyone." He paused, his hands gripping the fence rail. "Then you came here, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to want to protect something precious, what it felt like to look forward instead of just looking back." Clara felt her heart race at his words, at the admission they contained. But before she could respond, Wyatt continued. I'm not saying this to put pressure on you or make you feel obligated. You don't owe me anything, Clara. But I need you to know that having you here has changed something in me, something I thought was broken beyond repair." Clara stared at this man who had given her so much respect, safety, purpose, and now something that might be love, and felt the walls around her own heart beginning to crack. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," she said softly. "I don't know how to be someone worth fighting for." "You don't have to know how," Wyatt replied. "You just have to be who you are. That's enough. That's more than enough." They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun set behind them, painting the garden in shades of gold and rose. Clara felt something shifting inside her, a gradual recognition that she might actually deserve the kindness she had been shown. The next morning brought a visitor of a different sort. Dr. Patterson arrived just after breakfast, his medical bag in hand, and his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Clara," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to check on how you're settling in." Clara invited him in for coffee, grateful for his kindness even as she wondered about the timing of his visit. "I heard about Morrison's visit yesterday, Doctor," Patterson explained after they were seated in the front room. "Word travels fast in a small town, and I wanted to make sure you understood your legal position." "Legal position?" Clara asked. "The auction was legitimate, Miss Clara, but it didn't make you anyone's property. You're a free woman who chose to accept Wyatt's offer of employment and shelter. If anyone suggests otherwise, they're wrong, and more importantly, they're breaking the law." The distinction was important, Clara realized. She hadn't been sold like livestock. She had been rescued and offered a choice. The knowledge strengthened her resolve to stay and fight for the life she was building. "Furthermore," Dr. Patterson continued, "I've taken the liberty of speaking with Sheriff Morrison about Murphy's intentions. The sheriff is aware that any harassment of you or this household will be met with appropriate legal action." Clara felt a wave of gratitude toward this kind man, who barely knew her, but was willing to stand up for her rights. "Thank you, Dr. Patterson. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No repayment necessary, my dear. Sometimes doing what's right is its own reward." As Dr. Patterson prepared to leave, he turned back to Clara with a gentle smile. "For what it's worth, Miss Clara, you look like a completely different person than the one I saw on that auction block. There's light in your eyes now, confidence in your bearing. Whatever you found here agrees with you." After he left, Clara stood on the front porch and looked out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary. The challenges ahead might be significant, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing them alone. Wyatt emerged from the barn and walked toward the house, and Clara felt her heart lift at the sight of him. Whatever came next, whatever trouble Murphy might bring, she would meet it with the strength she had found in this place, among these people who had taught her that she was worth protecting. The silver locket at her throat caught the morning light, and Clara touched it gently, remembering her mother's words about beauty that lived in the heart. Perhaps, she thought, it was finally time to let that beauty shine. October brought cooler mornings and the kind of crystalline light that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Clara had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and the rhythm of her days had settled into something that felt like contentment. She rose with the sun, helped Maria prepare breakfast for the household, spent her mornings learning ranch work, and devoted her afternoons to the domestic tasks that kept the large house running smoothly. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Clara discovered her mother's recipe book held more secrets than she had realized. She had been copying her mother's bread recipe for Maria when she noticed faded pencil marks in the margins notes written in her mother's careful script that Clara had never seen before. For Clara, when she has a home of her own, read one notation beside a recipe for apple preserves. "My darling girl will make this better than I ever did." Another note, tucked beside instructions for Christmas cookies, said simply, "Remember that love is the most important ingredient." Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages, discovering message after message her mother had left for her. It was as if Clara Mayfield had known her daughter would someday need these gentle encouragements, these reminders that she was loved and valued despite what the world might tell her. The most precious note was written on the inside back cover in slightly different ink, as if added later, "Clara has the strongest heart of anyone I know. She will survive what I cannot, and she will find happiness I can only dream of for her. She is my greatest achievement, my most beautiful creation." Clara was wiping tears from her cheeks when Wyatt appeared in the kitchen doorway, his boots dusty from the day's work and his hat in his hands. "Maria said you might like some help with the heavy lifting," he said, then noticed her emotional state. "Is everything all right?" Clara showed him the recipe book, her voice thick with emotion as she read some of her mother's hidden messages aloud. Wyatt listened with the patient attention he brought to everything important, his grey eyes soft with understanding. "She knew you'd find them when you needed them most," he said gently. "That's the mark of a wise mother." "I wish she could see me now," Clara said. "I wish she could know that her faith in me wasn't misplaced." "Who says she can't see you?" Wyatt replied. "Sometimes I talk to Rebecca when I'm working alone on the range. I tell her about the horses we're breaking, the cattle we're raising, the way the sunset looks different every evening. Maybe your mother hears you too, when you're cooking her recipes and remembering her love." The simple faith in his words touched Clara deeply. She had never thought of death as a conversation that continued, only as a silence that endured. But the idea that her mother might somehow be aware of her daughter's newfound happiness brought comfort she hadn't expected. That evening, Clara took extra care with supper, using one of her mother's more elaborate recipes to create a meal that would honor both the woman who had taught her and the people who had given her a place to use those skills. The kitchen, filled with the scents of rosemary and thyme, butter and fresh bread, creating an atmosphere of warmth and abundance that seemed to draw everyone home early. Wyatt had begun teaching Clara to read more advanced texts during their evening conversations on the front porch. What had started as practical instruction, helping her understand ranch records and correspondence, had evolved into something deeper. They read poetry together, sharing thoughts about the rhythms and meanings that spoke to each of them. They discussed the newspaper when it arrived from Denver, with Wyatt patiently explaining political and economic concepts that had been beyond Clara's limited education. "You have a quick mind," Wyatt told her one evening as they worked through a particularly complex article about territorial government. "You understand connections most people miss." Clara felt a familiar flush of pleasure at his praise, but also a growing confidence in her own abilities. "I never had the chance to learn before. Father needed me to work, not read. What would you have studied if you'd had the choice?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Medicine, maybe. Dr. Patterson's work seems so important, so meaningful. Or maybe teaching. I've always thought it would be wonderful to help children discover what they're capable of." "Those are noble ambitions," Wyatt said. "It's not too late, you know. There are correspondence courses, books you could study, if you wanted to pursue learning for its own sake." The idea that she might still have choices, still have opportunities to grow and change, struck Clara as revolutionary. She had spent so many years believing her life was fixed, determined by circumstances beyond her control, that the possibility of actively choosing her future felt almost overwhelming. Their quiet evening was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Clara tensed, remembering Morrison's previous visit, but relaxed when she recognized Charlie Webb's familiar silhouette. "Boss," Charlie called out as he dismounted quickly, "we've got trouble down at the south pasture. Someone cut the fence, and about 50 head of cattle are scattered to hell and back." Wyatt was on his feet immediately, his relaxed demeanor shifting to focused intensity. "Any sign of who did it?" "Hoof prints heading toward town. 3 horses, shod recent." Charlie's meaning was clear, without being spoken. This wasn't the work of drifters or random vandals. "Pete and Santos?" "Already out gathering the herd." "But boss, this feels like the beginning of something bigger." Clara watched Wyatt's face as he processed this information, saw the careful calculation behind his eyes. This was clearly more than simple mischief. It was a deliberate provocation designed to cost time, money, and peace of mind. "I'll ride out with you," Wyatt decided. "Clara, stay close to the house tonight. If anyone comes around asking questions or making offers, don't answer the door." Fear twisted in Clara's stomach as she realized this was likely connected to Murphy's continued interest in reclaiming her. "This is because of me, isn't it?" Wyatt turned to face her fully, his expression serious, but not unkind. "This is because some men think they can take what doesn't belong to them. But they're wrong, and they're about to learn exactly how wrong." After Wyatt and Charlie rode out, Clara and Maria sat together in the kitchen, both women trying to occupy their hands while their minds worried about what might come next. Maria taught Clara a complex embroidery stitch that required concentration, but neither woman's heart was truly in the domestic work. "Has this happened before?" Clara asked. "Trouble like this?" "Not exactly like this," Maria replied carefully. "But Wyatt has enemies. Success makes some men jealous, and kindness makes others think you're weak. Murphy is both jealous and stupid, which makes him dangerous." "Maybe I should leave," Clara said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Find somewhere far away where my past can't follow me." Maria set down her embroidery and looked at Clara with the kind of steady attention that demanded honesty. "Do you want to leave?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Clara thought about the blue room that had become her sanctuary, about the satisfaction of bread rising in the oven and horses nuzzling her hands for treats. She thought about evening conversations with Wyatt, about the way his eyes lit up when he explained something he was passionate about. She thought about belonging somewhere, being valued for who she was rather than tolerated despite who she wasn't. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to leave. This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." "Then you stay," Maria said firmly, "and we protect what matters to us." The men returned well after midnight, tired and frustrated. They had recovered most of the cattle, but the effort had taken hours and would require days of additional work to ensure the herd was properly settled. More importantly, the message had been delivered clearly. Murphy was willing to escalate his campaign of harassment. Over breakfast the next morning, Wyatt outlined his plans for increased security. "Pete will sleep in the barn for a while, and we'll post watches during the night. I've sent word to Sheriff Morrison about the fence cutting, though I don't expect much help from that quarter." "What about going to the territorial authorities?" Clara suggested. "Surely there's someone with more power than a local sheriff." Wyatt smiled at her practical thinking. "There is, but involving outside law enforcement takes time, and Murphy knows it. He's counting on wearing us down with small attacks before we can build a larger case against him. So what do? We make it clear that this ranch is not an easy target. We document everything, protect our assets, and wait for Murphy to make the kind of mistake that will give us legal leverage against him." Clara admired Wyatt's strategic thinking, but she could see the strain this situation was putting on everyone. The ranch hands were alert and edgy. Maria jumped at unexpected sounds, and Wyatt himself seemed to carry a new tension in his shoulders. That afternoon, while helping Maria preserve the last of the garden vegetables before the first frost, Clara made a decision that surprised herself with its clarity. "I want to learn to shoot," she announced. Maria looked up from the tomatoes she was peeling. "Shoot? A gun, a rifle or pistol, or whatever Wyatt thinks is appropriate. I want to be able to protect myself, and this house if necessary." Maria studied Clara's face for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "That is wise. A woman should know how to defend what she values." When Clara presented her request to Wyatt that evening, she expected him to refuse or at least express concern about the dangers of firearms. Instead, he considered her words thoughtfully. "Have you ever handled a gun before?" "No, but I'm willing to learn. I don't want to be helpless if trouble comes to this house." "All right," Wyatt agreed. "We'll start with basic safety and work up to marksmanship." "But Clara, I want you to understand that carrying a weapon changes things. Once you're armed, people will expect you to be willing to use that weapon. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Clara thought about everything she had gained in her weeks at the ranch: dignity, purpose, love, hope for the future. Then she thought about the men who wanted to take those things away from her, who saw her as property to be claimed rather than a person with rights and choices. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm prepared." The next morning, Wyatt began Clara's education in firearms with a patient thoroughness that reminded her of his approach to teaching her about horses and cattle. They started with safety rules, repeated until they became instinctive, then moved to basic handling and cleaning. Only after Clara had demonstrated complete comfort with the mechanics did Wyatt allow her to load and fire the weapon. Clara's first shots went wide of any conceivable target, but Wyatt remained encouraging. "Shooting is like anything else, it requires practice and patience. You're not trying to become a gunfighter, just competent enough to protect yourself if necessary." By the end of the week, Clara could hit a tin can at 20 paces more often than not. More importantly, she had developed the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing she had options, that she wasn't completely dependent on others for her safety. The knowledge that she could defend herself seemed to unlock something in Clara's spirit that had been constrained by years of learned helplessness. She stood straighter, spoke more directly, and met challenges with a new kind of determined optimism. "You're becoming quite formidable," Wyatt observed one evening as they practiced together. "I almost feel sorry for anyone foolish enough to underestimate you." Clara smiled at the compliment, but her expression grew serious as she studied his face. "Wyatt, when this trouble with Murphy is over, what happens then?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what is my place here? Am I an employee who can leave at any time, a guest who's overstayed her welcome, a responsibility you've taken on out of charity?" Clara's voice was steady, but Wyatt could hear the vulnerability beneath her questions. He set down his own rifle and turned to face her fully. "What would you like your place to be?" Clara looked at this man who had shown her what kindness looked like, who had taught her to see herself as valuable and strong. The answer to his question was clear in her heart, even if speaking it aloud required more courage than she had ever summoned before. "I'd like to be someone you choose to keep, not someone you feel obligated to protect." Wyatt's smile was soft and full of promise. "Clara Mayfield, you stopped being an obligation the moment you started making this place feel like home again. The question isn't whether I want you to stay. The question is whether you're willing to build something permanent with a stubborn rancher who's still learning how to let himself be happy." Clara felt her heart race with hope and possibility. But before she could respond, their moment was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch at speed. This time, however, the visitors were not bringing trouble. Sheriff Morrison rode up with 3 deputies, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Behind them came Dr. Patterson and 2 other respectable men from town. "Wyatt, Miss Clara," Sheriff Morrison called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk. It seems Murphy's made a mistake that's going to change everything." Sheriff Morrison dismounted with the careful movements of a man carrying news that would change everything. The deputies flanked him respectfully, while Dr. Patterson and the other townsmen remained mounted, their faces grave with the weight of revelation. "What kind of mistake?" Wyatt asked, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Clara's shoulder, a gesture of protection that had become natural between them. "The kind that involves forged documents and fraudulent debt claims," Sheriff Morrison replied, producing a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "Murphy got careless. Started bragging in his cups about how easy it was to create paper that looked official enough to fool a desperate man." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Forged documents?" Dr. Patterson spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had delivered difficult truths for 40 years. "Miss Clara, I'm afraid your father never actually owed Murphy $400. The poker debt was fabricated, along with the promissory notes that gave Murphy the right to collect on your services. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She sank into the porch chair behind her, her mind reeling with the implications. But the other debts, the saloon, the general store, Dr. Williams, those were real, Sheriff Morrison confirmed. About $300 total. Still more than your father could pay, but not the crushing sum that forced you onto that auction block. Clara stared at the legal documents. Sheriff Morrison spread across the porch table, her mother's silver locket suddenly feeling heavy against her chest. You're saying I was never legally bound to anyone? That the auction was based on false information? That's exactly what we're saying, Dr. Patterson said gently. Murphy fabricated evidence to inflate your father's debt because he wanted to acquire you specifically. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The revelation hit Clara with sickening force. Murphy hadn't simply taken advantage of her father's gambling problem. He had actively created the circumstances that led to her public humiliation. She had been targeted, hunted, manipulated into a position where she had no choice but to submit to his plans. Where is Murphy now? Wyatt's voice carried a dangerous edge that made the deputies shift uncomfortably. That's where things get complicated. Sheriff Morrison admitted, Murphy's disappeared, left town sometime in the night, and nobody seems to know where he went. But before he ran, he made some threats that concern me greatly. What kind of threats? According to several witnesses, Murphy claimed that if he couldn't have Clara legally, he'd take her by other means. He was heard saying that Wyatt Callahan's ranch was too isolated for anyone to hear screaming. Clara's hands trembled as the full horror of her situation became clear. Murphy hadn't given up when Wyatt's boots won the auction. He had simply changed his approach. The fence cutting, the harassment, the gradual escalation of pressure, it had all been designed to soften the target before the real attack came. How long has he been gone? Wyatt asked. Since last night. But Wyatt, there's more. Sheriff Morrison's expression grew even more serious. We found evidence that Murphy's been in contact with some unsavory characters from Denver, men with reputations for violence and few scruples about how they earn their money. The implication was clear. Murphy had hired professionals to accomplish what he couldn't achieve through legal or social pressure. Clara was not just in danger. She was being actively hunted by men who made their living through cruelty and violence. What are my options? Clara asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Dr. Patterson leaned forward in his saddle. Legally, you're completely free. Always have been. Murphy's fraud invalidates any claim he might have had, and the territorial authorities are prepared to issue warrants for his arrest on charges of forgery and conspiracy. But that doesn't help with the immediate threat, Sheriff Morrison added. Legal vindication won't stop Murphy's hired guns if they're already on their way. Clara stood up slowly, her mind working through the possibilities with a clarity that surprised her. 6 weeks at the ranch had taught her to think strategically, to consider options and consequences rather than simply reacting to whatever crisis demanded immediate attention. How many men is he likely to have hired? She asked. Hard to say. Maybe 3 or 4. Murphy's got money, but he's not wealthy enough to finance a small army. And how long before they might arrive? Could be today. Could be next week. Depends on how quickly Murphy could make his arrangements and how far the men had to travel. Clara looked at Wyatt, reading the calculation in his grey eyes. He was assessing the ranch's defenses, considering how to protect not just her but Maria, the ranch hands, and everything they had all worked to build. There's another option, Clara said quietly. I could leave, go somewhere far away where Murphy would never find me. The silence that followed her suggestion was heavy with unspoken implications. Everyone understood that running might be the safest course, but everyone also understood what such a choice would cost. No. Wyatt's voice carried absolute finality. You're not running from this. You've done nothing wrong, and you don't deserve to spend your life looking over your shoulder because of one man's obsession. But if staying puts everyone else in danger, then we deal with the danger, Wyatt interrupted. Together. This is your home, Clara. These are your people. We don't abandon family when trouble comes calling. Family. The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight and promise, and the kind of commitment Clara had never dared hope for. She looked around at the faces gathered on the porch: Sheriff Morrison with his weathered integrity, Dr. Patterson with his gentle strength, the deputies who had ridden out to deliver justice rather than pursue personal gain. "What do you recommend?" she asked Sheriff Morrison. "Short term, we post guards and wait to see what Murphy's planning. Long term, we build a case that will put him in territorial prison for the rest of his life." Morrison's smile was grim but satisfied. Murphy made a fatal error when he decided to forge legal documents. Fraud is a serious crime, and the territorial authorities take it personally when someone undermines the legal system. Dr. Patterson added his own perspective. "I've already spoken with the other business owners in town. The debt your father actually owed can be settled for far less than the original amount, and several people are willing to extend credit terms that would allow you to pay it off over time." "I don't understand," Clara said. "Why would they do that?" "Because Murphy's behavior has disgusted decent people," Dr. Patterson explained. "The way he manipulated your situation, the threats he's made, it's reminded everyone what kind of man he really is. People want to help, Clara. They want to make this right." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected display of community support. The same people who had whispered about her plainness and poverty were now willing to stand up against a powerful man on her behalf. "There's something else," Sheriff Morrison said, consulting his notes. "We've recovered some of Murphy's personal papers, including correspondence that suggests this isn't the first time he's used forged documents to coerce vulnerable women. There may be other victims, other families he's destroyed with his schemes." The revelation hit Clara like a thunderbolt. She hadn't been Murphy's only target. She had been part of a pattern, a systematic exploitation of women who had no one to protect them. The knowledge filled her with a righteous anger that burned away the last traces of self-doubt. "What can I do to help build the case against him?" she asked. "Document everything," Sheriff Morrison advised. "Every threat, every act of harassment, every detail you can remember about your father's actual gambling debts versus what Murphy claimed. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case becomes." As the law enforcement officials prepared to leave, Wyatt pulled Sheriff Morrison aside for a private conversation. Clara couldn't hear their words, but she could see the serious nature of their discussion, the way both men's expressions grew increasingly grim. After the visitors departed, Clara found herself alone with Wyatt on the front porch as the sun began to set behind the mountains. The knowledge that she was legally free should have brought relief, but instead she felt a strange mixture of anger and uncertainty. "You knew, didn't you?" she said suddenly. "You suspected the debt papers weren't legitimate." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the porch, railing as he chose his words carefully. "I suspected something wasn't right. Murphy's not known for extending credit to men like your father, and the amount seemed too convenient, just enough to force desperate choices, but not so much as to seem impossible. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't certain, and because—" Wyatt paused, struggling with his own honesty. "Because I was afraid if you knew you were free to leave, you might choose to go." Clara stared at him, processing this admission. "You thought I was only here out of obligation?" "I didn't know," Wyatt said honestly. "I hoped you were starting to care about this place, about us. But I couldn't be sure, and I was selfish enough to want you to stay, even if it meant keeping you in the dark about your legal freedom." The confession hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of broken trust. Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at his deception, understanding of his fear, and something deeper that might have been relief. "Do you know what the worst part of my life has been?" she asked quietly. "Not the poverty, not the loneliness, not even the humiliation of that auction block. The worst part has been never knowing if anyone would choose me if they had other options." Wyatt turned to face her fully, his grey eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Clara, let me finish," she said, holding up her hand. You were afraid I'd leave if I knew I was free. But Wyatt, the fact that I'm free, truly free, and I'm choosing to stay here, choosing to fight for this life we're building together, doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about how I feel?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Finally, Wyatt spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Clara. I didn't plan it, didn't expect it, but somewhere between watching you gentle my horses and seeing you stand up to your own fears, I fell completely in love with you." He paused, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles showed white. "I was terrified that if you knew you could leave freely, you'd realize you deserved better than a broken-down rancher with more scars than sense." Clara felt her heart race at his words, at the vulnerability he was showing her. "And I love you," she replied simply. "Not because you rescued me, not because I owe you anything, but because you see me as I really am, and you choose to love that person." The admission seemed to break something loose in both of them. Wyatt stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "When this trouble with Murphy is over," he said softly, "I want to ask you something properly, with my father's ring and a future that belongs to both of us." Clara's smile was radiant with hope and certainty. "When this trouble is over," she agreed, "I want to say yes." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed, but this time it was Pete and Santos returning from their patrol of the ranch boundaries. "Boss," Pete called out as he dismounted quickly, "we found tracks, 3 horses, maybe 4, coming from the direction of Millerville. They stopped about a mile out and seemed to be watching the house." Wyatt's demeanor shifted immediately from lover to protector. "How fresh." "Within the last few hours, they're keeping their distance for now, but they're definitely scouting our defenses." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Murphy's hired men had arrived, and the real danger was about to begin. "All right," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced worse threats than hired gunmen. "Pete, I want you and Charlie to take shifts watching the approaches to the house. Santos, check the stock and make sure the animals are secure. If shooting starts, I don't want cattle scattered to hell and back again." "What about me?" Clara asked. Wyatt looked at her seriously. "You've been learning to shoot. Are you ready to use that skill if necessary?" Clara thought about everything she had gained in her weeks at the ranch: dignity, love, a future worth fighting for. Then she thought about the men lurking in the darkness who wanted to take those things away from her. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, strategic positions were identified, and plans were made for various contingencies. Maria moved through the house with calm efficiency, securing valuables and preparing supplies, as if she had done this many times before. "Have you?" Clara asked as they worked together to move furniture away from windows. "Faced trouble like this?" "A few times, in the early days when this was still wild country. Wyatt's not the only one who knows how to fight when necessary." As midnight approached, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet. Clara found herself stationed in the study, with a clear view of the front approach, a rifle loaded and ready beside her. The knowledge that she was legally free should have made this confrontation feel different, but the immediate threat remained the same men with guns who wanted to take her away from everything she had come to love. The attack, when it came, was not what anyone expected. Instead of a direct assault on the house, the hired men struck at the barn where the horses were kept. The sound of splintering wood and frightened animals carried clearly across the yard, followed by shouts and the crack of gunfire. "They're trying to steal our horses," Wyatt said grimly as he grabbed his rifle. "Without mounts, we can't pursue them if they manage to take you." Clara understood the strategy immediately. Murphy's men weren't just trying to kidnap her, they were systematically dismantling the ranch's ability to respond or retaliate. "I'm coming with you," she said, checking her own weapon. "Clara, it's too dangerous." "Those are my horses too," she interrupted, "and this is my home they're attacking. I'm not hiding while other people fight for what we've all built together." Wyatt looked at her for a moment, seeing not the frightened girl who had stood on the auction block, but the strong woman she had become. "Stay close to me," he said finally, "and if I tell you to run, you run." Together, they slipped out the back door and made their way toward the barn, where the sounds of conflict continued to echo in the darkness. Clara's heart pounded with fear and determination in equal measure, but her hands remained steady on her rifle. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she had come to love. As they approached the barn, Clara whispered a quick prayer to her mother's memory, asking for strength and courage to protect the family she had finally found. The silver locket at her throat caught a shaft of moonlight, and Clara touched it once for luck before stepping into the battle that would determine whether love was stronger than greed, whether justice could triumph over cruelty, and whether a woman dismissed as worthless could prove her true value when everything that mattered hung in the balance. The barn loomed ahead of them in the moonlight, its familiar silhouette now transformed into something ominous by the sounds of violence emanating from within. Clara could hear horses whinnying in fear, the crash of kicked stalls, and men's voices raised in anger and frustration. Whatever Murphy's hired guns had planned, it wasn't going smoothly. Wyatt held up his hand, signaling Clara to stop while he assessed the situation. Through the open barn doors, they could see the flicker of lantern light and moving shadows that suggested at least 3 men working to free the horses from their stalls. "Charlie's in there," Wyatt whispered, pointing to a figure pressed against the far wall of the barn. "He's got them pinned for now, but he's outnumbered." Clara could see their friend crouched behind a feed barrel, his rifle trained on the intruders, but unable to get a clear shot without risking the horses. The animals were panicking, adding chaos to an already dangerous situation. "Can we circle around?" Clara asked quietly. "There's a back entrance, but it'll mean crossing open ground." Wyatt studied the layout, his tactical mind working through possibilities. "If they see us coming, then we make sure they're too busy to look," Clara interrupted, an idea forming in her mind. "What if we create a distraction at the front while Charlie moves to better position?" Wyatt looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. What kind of distraction? Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications of what she was about to suggest. "What if I let them see me? Draw them outside where we have better odds?" "Absolutely not." Wyatt's response was immediate and firm. "You're not using yourself as bait." "I'm not talking about surrendering to them," Clara clarified. "I'm talking about appearing just long enough to get them to come after me, then leading them into an ambush." "Clara, think about it, Wyatt. They're here for me specifically. If they see a chance to take me without having to fight through all of you, they'll take it. And if we choose the ground for that confrontation, instead of letting them choose it." Wyatt was already shaking his head, but Clara could see him considering the tactical merits of her suggestion. It was risky, but it would give them the initiative instead of simply reacting to whatever Murphy's men decided to do next. "There has to be another way," he said. Before Clara could respond, a new sound joined the chaos from the barn, Pete's voice, raised in a shout of warning. Through the darkness, they could see muzzle flashes as he engaged with what appeared to be a 4th man approaching from the opposite direction. "They're trying to surround us," Clara realized. "Pete's cut off, Charlie's pinned down, and we're caught in the middle." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a raid on the horses was becoming a coordinated attack on the entire ranch. Clara felt a cold clarity settle over her as she understood what needed to be done. "I'm going to make myself visible," she said, checking her rifle one final time. "When they come after me, I'll lead them toward the house where Maria can provide covering fire from the windows. That will free you to help Charlie and Pete. I won't let you face them alone." "You won't be letting me do anything," Clara replied, steel entering her voice. "I'm choosing to do this because it's the best chance we have to protect everyone." Wyatt stared at her, seeing not the frightened girl from the auction block, but a woman who had found her courage and was willing to use it to protect the people she loved. "If you do this, he said finally. You stay mobile. Don't let them corner you. Don't try to be a hero. Your job is to draw them off and survive until we can get to you. Clara nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was about to attempt. Wyatt, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, he interrupted. But Clara, I need you to know having you here, loving you, it's made me remember what I was fighting for all those years ago. You've given me back my future. The emotion in his voice made Clara's throat tight, but there was no time for lengthy goodbyes. She touched the silver locket at her throat one last time, drawing strength from her mother's memory, then stepped into the moonlight where the men in the barn could see her. Looking for me? She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The effect was immediate. The chaos in the barn subsided as the intruders registered her presence, and Clara could hear urgent whispers as they tried to decide how to respond to this unexpected opportunity. That's her, one of them hissed. Murphy said she'd try to run if we gave her the chance. Clara began walking slowly toward the house, making herself an easy target while staying far enough ahead to avoid being caught immediately. Behind her, she could hear the men emerging from the barn, their attention now focused entirely on her instead of the horses or the tactical situation. Come on, girl, another voice called out. No point making this harder than it has to be. We're just here to collect what Murphy paid for. The casual cruelty in the man's tone strengthened Clara's resolve. These weren't desperate men driven by circumstance. They were professionals who enjoyed their work, who saw her suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy. Murphy's money was built on lies, Clara called back, continuing her measured retreat toward the house. I was never his to sell. Don't matter now, the first man replied, and Clara could hear him getting closer. Contract's a contract, legal or not. Clara reached the front porch and turned to face her pursuers, raising her rifle with steady hands. 3 men approached through the moonlight, their weapons drawn, but not yet aimed. They were confident, expecting easy prey. Far enough, Clara said, her voice carrying an authority that made the men pause. Now, miss, the apparent leader said in a tone that might have been meant to sound reasonable, you don't want to do anything foolish. We're professionals. We can do this easy or we can do this hard, but either way, you're coming with us. The only place I'm going, Clara replied, is back inside my home. The standoff stretched taut as both sides assessed their options. Clara could see movement in the shadows around the barn, suggesting that Wyatt had used her distraction to reposition for his own attack. The plan was working, but its success depended on her ability to hold these men's attention for just a few more moments. Your home? The leader laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. Girl, you don't seem to understand your situation. You belong to Murphy now, bought and paid for. This ranch, these people, they're just obstacles between you and your rightful owner. The word owner sent ice through Clara's veins, but it also crystallized her determination. She had spent too many years believing other people's definitions of her worth to accept that assessment now. I belong to myself, she said clearly, and I choose to stay here with people who respect that choice. The leader's patience was clearly wearing thin. Boys, looks like we're doing this the hard way. Clara saw the men beginning to spread out, trying to flank her position, and knew her time was running out. But before the situation could escalate further, the night erupted with gunfire from multiple directions. Wyatt's voice carried across the yard. Charlie, now. The coordinated attack began with Charlie emerging from the barn, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. One of Murphy's men dropped immediately, while the other 2 dove for cover behind a water trough. Simultaneously, Pete appeared from the side of the house, having worked his way around the building to get behind the attackers. His first shot shattered the lantern one of the men had been carrying, plunging that section of the yard into darkness. Clara used the confusion to retreat up the porch steps, but maintained her position where she could provide covering fire if needed. Through the front windows, she could see Maria moving with purpose, preparing to defend the house if the battle moved closer. Santos! Wyatt shouted over the gunfire. "Circle around and cut off their retreat." The engagement was brief but intense. Murphy's hired guns had expected to face a lone rancher and his frightened woman, not a coordinated defense by experienced fighters. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 attackers were down, and the 3rd was calling for surrender. "Don't shoot!" the survivor yelled, his hands visible in the moonlight. "I'm done! I'm done!" Wyatt emerged from the shadows, his rifle trained on the remaining gunman. "Kick your weapons away and get on your knees." The man complied, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Look, this was just a job, nothing personal. Murphy hired us to bring back the girl, said she belonged to him legal." "Murphy lied," Wyatt said coldly. "About the debt, about the law, about everything. We didn't know that." The man protested. "We just do what we're paid to do." Clara stepped forward, her rifle still ready but pointed safely away from everyone. "Where is Murphy now?" The gunman looked up at her with a mixture of fear and confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile the armed woman before him with whatever description Murphy had provided. "Don't know for sure," he admitted. "He said he'd meet us in Denver after we brought you back. Had some story about taking you to California where the law couldn't interfere." The implications were chilling. Murphy hadn't just wanted to reclaim Clara. He had planned to take her somewhere completely beyond the reach of justice or rescue. "What about the other women?" Clara pressed. "Murphy's done this before, hasn't he?" The gunman's expression grew uncomfortable. "That ain't my business. I just transport people who need transporting." Sheriff Morrison chose that moment to arrive with his deputies, having heard the gunfire from their position closer to town. The sight of law enforcement seemed to deflate the last of the fight from Murphy's hired gun. "Well," Morrison said, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction, "looks like we have ourselves a witness to Murphy's criminal enterprise." As the deputies secured the surviving attacker and tended to the wounded, Clara found herself standing in the yard where she had nearly been kidnapped, looking at the place that had become her sanctuary. The silver locket at her throat caught the moonlight, and she thought about her mother's faith that beauty lived in the heart rather than the surface. Tonight, she had discovered something about herself that might have remained hidden forever if Murphy hadn't forced the confrontation. She was not just capable of being loved, she was capable of fighting for that love, of protecting the people and places that mattered to her. Wyatt approached her slowly, his rifle lowered, but his eyes still scanning for any remaining threats. "It's over," he said quietly. "Murphy's finished, and so are his plans for you." Clara nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. "What happens now?" "Now," Wyatt said, reaching for her hand, "we start building the future we talked about, the one that belongs to both of us." As they walked back toward the house together, Clara realized that the woman who had stood on the auction block 7 weeks ago was truly gone, replaced by someone stronger and more certain of her own worth. The transformation had been painful and frightening, but it had also been necessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal proceedings, rebuilding what had been damaged, learning to live without the constant threat of Murphy's interference. But tonight, surrounded by people who had been willing to fight for her, Clara Mayfield finally understood what it meant to be home. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the ranch, Clara stood before her bedroom mirror, wearing a dress that represented everything she had never dared to dream possible. The green silk had cost more than she had ever spent on anything in her entire life, but Maria had insisted that certain occasions demanded proper attire. "Tonight is not the time for modesty," Maria had declared while helping Clara with the delicate buttons that ran up the back of the dress. "Tonight is the time for showing Red Hollow exactly who Clara Mayfield has become." The dress was beautiful in its simplicity, no excessive ruffles or ostentatious decoration, just clean lines that flattered Clara's figure and rich fabric that caught the light as she moved. But more than the dress itself, Clara was struck by the woman wearing it. This was not the same person who had cowered under the town's judgment 7 weeks ago. This woman stood straight, met her own eyes in the mirror without flinching, and wore confidence like a second skin. The occasion was Red Hollow's Harvest Dance, an annual celebration that brought together ranchers, townspeople, and anyone else within riding distance for an evening of music, food, and community. Clara had never attended before. Her father's reputation and her own social standing had made such events impossible. But this year, everything was different. Murphy had been captured in Denver 3 days after the attack on the ranch, brought back in chains to face charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. His hired gun had provided detailed testimony about Murphy's criminal enterprise, leading to the discovery of at least 6 other women who had been victimized by similar schemes. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now facing decades in territorial prison. More importantly, for Clara's immediate situation, the revelation of Murphy's fraud had transformed her, standing in Red Hollow almost overnight. The same people who had once whispered about her plainness now spoke admiringly of her courage. The women who had pitied her poverty now sought her friendship. The men who had ignored her existence now treated her with genuine respect. Dr. Patterson had spearheaded a community effort to clear the remaining legitimate debts from her father's estate, accepting donations from dozens of families who wanted to demonstrate their support. The total amount raised had exceeded what was needed, and the surplus had been presented to Clara as a gift to help her start her new life. "The people of this town owe you an apology, Doctor," Patterson had said when presenting her with the money. "We should have seen Murphy's cruelty for what it was years ago. We should have protected you instead of allowing you to suffer in silence." Clara had accepted the apology and the gift with grace, understanding that forgiveness was as much for her own peace of mind as for theirs. Carrying resentment would only poison the happiness she had found, and she had no intention of letting Murphy's evil continue to damage her life, even from his prison cell. Now, as she prepared for her first public appearance as a free woman, Clara felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded her of stage fright. The Harvest Dance would be her debut as someone who belonged in Red Hollow society, someone who had a place and a future, and people who cared about her welfare. Wyatt had spent the afternoon preparing for the evening with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for important business meetings. He had bathed, shaved with unusual precision, and put on his best suit, a dark wool outfit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his gray eyes look almost silver in the right light. "You clean up well, Cowboy," Clara had teased when she saw him waiting in the front parlor. "You haven't seen yourself yet," he had replied, his voice carrying an undertone that made her pulse quicken. Now, looking at her reflection in the mirror, Clara understood what he had meant. The green silk transformed her from a pretty woman into something approaching breathtaking. The color brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and the cut of the dress emphasized curves that had been hidden under her practical work clothes. But the most significant change was in her bearing. Clara carried herself like a woman who knew her own worth, who had discovered that strength and kindness could coexist, and who was no longer afraid to let her inner beauty shine through her external appearance. A knock at her bedroom door interrupted her self-examination. "Clara," Wyatt's voice carried through the wood, "the carriage is ready when you are." Clara took one final look at herself, touching the silver locket that rested against the green silk. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. "Beauty isn't what people see on the outside, my darling. It's what lives in here." Tonight, for the first time in her life, Clara felt that both kinds of beauty were working in harmony. She opened the door to find Wyatt waiting in the hallway, and the expression on his face when he saw her made all of Maria's fussing with buttons and fabric worthwhile. "Clara," he said softly, "you're absolutely magnificent." The sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm, but she met his admiring gaze without the self-consciousness that would have overwhelmed her weeks ago. "Thank you. You're rather impressive yourself." They walked down the stairs together, and Clara noticed how natural it felt to have Wyatt's arms supporting her, how right it seemed to be moving through the world as partners rather than as protector and protected. Maria was waiting in the front parlor with a small velvet box in her hands. "Rebecca wanted you to have this," she said, opening the box to reveal a delicate bracelet of silver and turquoise. She said it would bring good fortune to the next woman who loved this ranch as much as she did. Clara's throat tightened with emotion as Maria fastened the bracelet around her wrist. The gesture felt like a blessing, a final acceptance into the family that had welcomed her so completely. "She would be happy to see Wyatt smiling again," Maria continued, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She would be happy to know that love had found its way back to this house." The drive to town passed in comfortable conversation, with Wyatt describing the people Clara would meet and the traditions she could expect. But Clara found herself more focused on the man beside her than on his words. The weeks of shared danger and gradual trust had revealed depths to Wyatt's character that made her love him more with each passing day. He was kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, and wise enough to understand that true partnership required two people who chose each other freely rather than one person rescuing another out of obligation. Tonight would mark not just Clara's debut in Red Hollow society, but also the public acknowledgement of their relationship as equals. As they approached the town hall where the dance was being held, Clara could see light spilling from the windows and hear the sound of fiddle music carried on the evening breeze. Carriages and horses filled the area around the building, and well-dressed people moved in and out of the entrance in groups that spoke of long-standing friendships and community connections. "Are you ready for this?" Wyatt asked, as he helped her down from the carriage. Clara looked at the building where she would face the collective judgment of Red Hollow society for the first time as a free woman. Some of these people had watched her humiliation on the auction block. Others had whispered about her poverty and plainness for years. All of them would be measuring her against their memories of who she used to be. But Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had stood on that auction block. She was a woman who had discovered her own strength, who had fought for her happiness, and won. She was someone who belonged here, not because she had been rescued, but because she had earned her place through courage and determination. "I'm ready," she said, taking Wyatt's offered arm with steady hands. "Let's go show Red Hollow what we're made of." The moment Clara and Wyatt stepped through the doors of the town hall, a hush fell over the gathering that had nothing to do with rudeness and everything to do with amazement. The woman entering on Wyatt Callahan's arm bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had stood on the auction block 8 weeks earlier. Clara felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but instead of the crushing shame she had once experienced under such scrutiny, she felt only calm confidence. These people were seeing her clearly for the first time, and she was finally ready to be seen. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife who had once used Clara as a cautionary tale for her daughter, approached with something that looked remarkably like genuine warmth. "Miss Mayfield," she said, offering her hand in greeting, "you look absolutely radiant this evening. I do hope you'll forgive our past oversights. We should have seen your quality long ago." Clara accepted the handshake graciously, understanding that public acknowledgement of past wrongs was as close to an apology as social convention would allow. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate your kindness." The interaction seemed to signal permission for others to approach, and Clara found herself surrounded by people eager to make amends for years of neglect or outright cruelty. She accepted their overtures with dignity, neither gloating over their change of heart nor rejecting their attempts at reconciliation. Dr. Patterson appeared at her elbow with a glass of punch and a smile that warmed her heart. "Miss Clara, you've caused quite a stir this evening. I don't think Red Hollow has seen such a transformation since the widow Morrison surprised everyone by marrying that traveling preacher." "Thank you for everything you've done, Dr. Patterson," Clara said sincerely. "Your support meant more than you can know." "Nonsense. We simply did what should have been done years ago." He paused, studying her face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading people's emotional health. "You've found your place in the world, haven't you?" Clara looked around the room, seeing familiar faces now arranged in expressions of respect rather than pity or disdain. Near the refreshment table, she could see Maria laughing with Santos as they sampled the various dishes brought by community members. Charlie Webb was deep in conversation with the blacksmith about horse training techniques. Pete Donovan was holding court near the musicians, probably telling stories about the early days of ranching in the territory. And beside her, solid and reassuring, stood Wyatt, the man who had seen her worth when no one else bothered to look, who had given her the space to discover her own strength, and who loved her not, despite her past, but because of everything she had become. "Yes," Clara said simply, "I believe I have." The fiddle music began again, and couples started moving toward the center of the room, where space had been cleared for dancing. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness as she realized she had never learned proper dancing, another social grace that poverty had made impossible to acquire. "I should probably warn you," she said quietly to Wyatt. "I've never actually danced before. At least, not the kind of dancing they do at events like this." Wyatt's smile was gentle and understanding. "Then I'll teach you, just like I taught you to shoot and ride, and everything else you thought you couldn't do." He led her onto the dance floor as the musicians struck up a simple waltz, and Clara found herself in the center of the room with every eye upon them. But instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, she felt protected by Wyatt's steady presence and her own newfound confidence. "Just follow my lead," Wyatt murmured as he placed one hand on her waist and took her right hand in his left. "Trust me and let the music carry you." Clara had expected dancing to be complicated and embarrassing, full of intricate steps she would never master. Instead, she discovered it was simply another form of partnership, a way of moving together in harmony that required trust and attention to your partner's guidance. Wyatt led her through the basic steps with infinite patience, and Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the music and the gentle pressure of his hands directing her movements. Other couples joined them on the floor, but Clara barely noticed them. Her world had narrowed to the space between herself and Wyatt, to the magic of moving together as one person instead of two. "You're a natural," Wyatt said softly as they turned in time with the music. "Like everything else, you just needed someone to show you what you were capable of." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in his voice, the way he always spoke, as if her success was inevitable rather than surprising. "You make me feel like I can do anything." "You can do anything," Wyatt replied seriously. "You proved that when you stood up to Murphy's men. You proved it when you chose to stay and fight for what you wanted instead of running away. You prove it every day, just by being who you are." As the waltz ended and the musicians prepared for the next song, Clara realized that something significant was happening. This wasn't just a dance or a social gathering, it was a public declaration that she and Wyatt belonged together, that their relationship was real and acknowledged by the community. Sheriff Morrison approached them as they left the dance floor, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Miss Clara, I thought you'd like to know that Murphy's trial date has been set. 3 months from now, and the territorial attorney is confident about securing convictions on all charges." "What does that mean for the other women he victimized?" Clara asked. "They'll finally get justice. And more importantly, Murphy will never be in a position to hurt anyone else again." Morrison paused, his expression growing more personal. "I owe you an apology, Miss Clara. I should have looked more closely at those debt papers when they first crossed my desk. If I had been more careful—" "You couldn't have known," Clara interrupted gently. "Murphy was very careful to make his forgeries look legitimate. What matters is that justice is being served now." As Sheriff Morrison moved away, Clara felt Wyatt's hand squeeze hers gently. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Clara," he said quietly, "there's something I need to ask you." Before she could respond, Wyatt was reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box that Clara recognized immediately. The box that had held his father's wedding ring, the symbol of love and commitment that had been waiting for the right moment to matter again. The conversations around them seemed to fade as Wyatt opened the box to reveal the simple gold band nestled inside. The ring caught the light from the oil lamps, warm and beautiful in its understated elegance. "Clara Mayfield," Wyatt said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the room. "You've taught me that some things are worth fighting for, that love can survive even the worst circumstances, and that two people who choose each other freely can build something stronger than anything that tries to tear them apart." Clara felt her heart racing as she understood what was happening. This was the moment they had both been waiting for, the formal beginning of the future they had discussed in whispers and stolen glances. "I'm asking you to marry me," Wyatt continued, "not because I rescued you or because you owe me anything, but because I love you completely, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice when you decided to stay." Clara looked down at the ring, then up into Wyatt's grey eyes, seeing all the love and hope and vulnerability he was offering her. Around them, she was dimly aware that the entire room had grown quiet, that everyone was waiting to hear her response to this very public proposal. But in that moment, Clara wasn't thinking about the audience or the social significance of what was happening. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place, from the auction block, where she had believed herself worthless, to this moment, when the finest man she had ever known was asking her to be his partner in life. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Yes, Wyatt Callahan, I will marry you." The cheer that erupted from the crowd was immediate and heartfelt, but Clara barely heard it. Her attention was focused entirely on Wyatt's face as relief and joy transformed his features, on the gentle care with which he lifted her left hand and slipped his father's ring onto her finger. The gold band fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years specifically for her hand. Clara stared down at it in wonder, this symbol of promises made and kept, of love that endured through hardship and emerged stronger on the other side. "It's beautiful," she said softly, though she knew the ring's true beauty lay not in its craftsmanship, but in what it represented. "It belongs on your hand," Wyatt replied, his voice rough with emotion. "It's been waiting for you just like I have." Dr. Patterson was the first to reach them, his weathered face bright with genuine happiness. "Congratulations to you both," he said warmly, shaking Wyatt's hand and kissing Clara's cheek with fatherly affection. "This is exactly what this community needed, to see that love and decency can triumph over cruelty and greed." Mrs. Henderson followed close behind, her earlier reserve replaced by what appeared to be sincere enthusiasm. "Miss Mayfield, or should I say, future Mrs. Callahan, you've given us all a lesson in grace and strength. This wedding is going to be the social event of the season." Clara felt a moment of panic at the thought of a large, elaborate wedding ceremony, but Wyatt seemed to sense her concern. "We're planning something simple," he said diplomatically. "Family and close friends, nothing too formal." "Nonsense," declared Maria, appearing beside them with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "This wedding will be perfect, but it will be perfect because it celebrates what matters: love, family, and the beginning of a beautiful life together." As more well-wishers crowded around them, Clara found herself swept up in a whirlwind of congratulations, advice, and excited planning discussions. The women wanted to talk about her dress, the men wanted to discuss wedding feasts, and everyone seemed to have opinions about the timing and location of the ceremony. Through it all, Wyatt remained by her side, his presence steady and reassuring, even as the social obligations threatened to overwhelm her. Clara realized that this was what partnership truly meant, not just the grand gestures and passionate declarations, but the quiet support that helped you navigate life's complexities without losing yourself in them. When the musicians struck up another waltz, Wyatt led Clara back onto the dance floor, and this time she moved with complete confidence. The steps that had seemed so mysterious an hour earlier now felt natural, and she was able to focus on the pure joy of moving in harmony with the man she loved. "Do you have any regrets?" Wyatt asked as they turned in time with the music. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she had endured to reach this moment, the years of poverty and loneliness, the humiliation of the auction, the terror of Murphy's threats. All of it had been painful, but it had also been necessary to bring her to this place, to this man, to this understanding of her own worth. "Only one," she said finally. Wyatt's expression grew concerned. "What's that?" "I regret that my mother isn't here to see this," Clara said, touching the silver locket at her throat. "She would have loved you, and she would have been so proud to see me finally understanding what she tried to teach me about beauty that lives in the heart." "She is here," Wyatt said gently. "In every lesson she taught you, every moment of strength she gave you, every bit of love she filled your heart with. She's here, Clara, and she's seeing exactly what she always knew you would become." Clara felt tears spill over at his words, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Around them, the music swelled, and other couples moved in their own private worlds of connection and commitment. Through the windows, she could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over her during those lonely nights when she had believed herself destined for nothing but suffering. "I love you, Wyatt Callahan," she said, the words carrying all the wonder and gratitude and hope she felt for their future together. "And I love you, Clara Mayfield," he replied. "Soon to be Clara Callahan, partner in all my adventures and keeper of all my secrets." As the waltz ended and the evening began to wind down, Clara realized that the woman who had entered this room a few hours earlier was not quite the same person who would leave it. Tonight had been more than a social debut or even an engagement celebration. It had been a transformation ceremony, a public acknowledgement that Clara Mayfield had finally, truly, become the person she was always meant to be. The green silk dress had been beautiful, the dancing had been magical, and the proposal had been perfect. But what mattered most was the knowledge that she was going home with a man who loved her completely, to a life they would build together as equals, in a place where she had finally learned to see herself as she truly was, not the ugliest bride in town, but a woman of worth, strength, and beauty, who had simply been waiting for the right moment to shine. 6 months later, Clara Callahan stood on the front porch of her home, watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. Her wedding ring caught the early light, still new enough to surprise her when she glimpsed it while working, but familiar enough now to feel like a natural part of her hand. The wedding had taken place in December, a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor, with just family and close friends in attendance. Clara had worn her mother's white dress, carefully altered by Maria's skilled hands, and carried wildflowers that Wyatt had pressed for her from the prairie where they had taken their first ride together. Dr. Patterson had performed the ceremony, his weathered hands steady as he pronounced them husband and wife, according to the laws of God and the territory. The most meaningful moment had come when Wyatt placed his father's ring on Clara's finger for the second time, this one, official and permanent. "With this ring," he had said, his voice carrying across the small gathering, "I thee wed, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." But Clara had heard the unspoken promise beneath the traditional words that he was offering not just his possessions, but his complete trust, his unguarded heart, and his unwavering commitment to their partnership. Now, as spring brought new life to the prairie, Clara reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying morning when she had stood on the auction block, believing her life was over. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Clara's organizational skills complementing Wyatt's practical knowledge to create something more successful than either could have achieved alone. The new ranch sign that had been installed over the front gate told part of the story. Callahan Family Ranch, Est, 1871. The addition of family had been Clara's suggestion, a acknowledgement that this place was no longer just Wyatt's solitary refuge, but a home built by two people who had chosen to face the world together. Clara had discovered that she possessed a natural talent for managing the business side of ranching. Her careful attention to detail and ability to see patterns others missed had helped them identify new markets for their cattle and horses. More importantly, her genuine care for the animals and the people who worked with them had created an atmosphere of mutual respect that made the ranch more than just a business. It had become a community. The legal proceedings against Murphy had concluded with his conviction on multiple charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. He would spend the next 20 years in territorial prison, and the judge had ordered him to make restitution to all his victims. Clara had used her portion of the settlement money to establish a small fund that helped other women in desperate circumstances, ensuring that Murphy's evil would be transformed into something that served justice and compassion. More personally satisfying had been the letter she received from one of Murphy's other victims, a young woman named Sarah, who had managed to escape his schemes and build a new life for herself in Oregon. Your courage in testifying against him gave the rest of us the strength to tell our own stories, Sarah had written. You helped us understand that we were not responsible for what he did to us and that we deserved better than the lives he tried to force us into. This morning, Clara was waiting for a special visitor. Dr. Patterson had sent word that he was bringing someone to meet her, a young woman who had recently found herself in circumstances similar to Clara's own past situation. Her name was Emma. She was 17 years old, and she was pregnant with nowhere to go after her family had disowned her. Clara and Wyatt had discussed the matter and agreed immediately to help. The ranch was large enough to provide Emma with privacy and safety while she decided what she wanted to do about her future. More importantly, Clara understood better than most what it felt like to believe yourself worthless and alone, and she was determined to offer Emma the kind of support she had received from Maria and Wyatt. The sound of approaching horses announced Dr. Patterson's arrival. Clara smoothed her blue dress, not the calico Maria had given her, but a new one made from fabric she had chosen herself, and walked down from the porch to greet their guests. Emma was younger than Clara had expected, with the kind of fragile beauty that reminded Clara painfully of her own mother. The girl's eyes held the familiar combination of fear and resignation that Clara recognized from her own past, the look of someone who had learned to expect the worst from every situation. "Emma," Dr. Patterson said gently, "I'd like you to meet Clara Callahan. This is her ranch, and she's offered to let you stay here while you figure out your next steps." Emma's gaze moved from Clara to the ranch house, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the peaceful atmosphere, and the obvious prosperity of the operation. "I don't have any money to pay for room and board," she said quietly. "I can work, but I don't know how much I'll be able to do as I get further along." Clara stepped forward, remembering her own desperate calculations about what she could offer in exchange for basic survival. "Emma, you're not here as hired help or as someone who owes us anything. You're here as our guest, for as long as you need to be." The girl's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. "I don't understand. Why would you help someone you don't even know?" Clara smiled, thinking about all the people who had asked her similar questions over the past months. "Because someone helped me when I needed it most, because kindness creates more kindness, and because you deserve to be safe while you make the important decisions about your future." Over the following weeks, Clara watched Emma gradually begin to believe in her own worth again. The girl helped with light household tasks when she felt up to it, but Clara was careful to ensure that Emma understood her value wasn't dependent on her productivity. More importantly, Clara shared her own story, helping Emma understand that circumstances might define where you started, but they didn't have to determine where you ended up. "I thought my life was over," Emma confided one evening as they sat together on the front porch watching the sunset. "I thought being unmarried and pregnant meant I was ruined forever. That's what people want women like us to believe," Clara replied. "That we're defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to us, that we can't start over or build something better. But it's not true, Emma. You have choices, and you have value that no one can take away from you." One evening in late spring, as Clara was helping Maria prepare supper, Wyatt came into the kitchen with an expression that mixed excitement with carefully controlled hope. "Clara," he said, taking her hands in his, "I have something to tell you." The serious tone of his voice made Clara's heart skip, but the light in his eyes suggested good news rather than trouble. "What is it?" "Dr. Patterson came by this afternoon while you were helping Emma with her reading. He wanted to discuss your condition." Clara stared at him in confusion for a moment, before understanding dawned with a force that made her sink into the nearest chair. "My condition? You're going to have a baby, Clara, our baby." The words seemed to echo in the kitchen as Clara processed this news that would change everything. She thought about the future she and Wyatt had planned, the life they were building together, and tried to imagine adding a child to the picture. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about Wyatt's feelings given his tragic loss of Rebecca and their stillborn son. Wyatt knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers with infinite gentleness. "Clara, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at the same time. This baby will be born into love, into a home where it's wanted and valued. That's all any child can ask for." As the news settled in Clara's mind, she realized that her mother's locket felt warm against her throat, as if Clara Mayfield was somehow blessing this new generation of the family she had started with such love and hope. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Clara gave birth to a daughter with Wyatt's grey eyes and her own determined chin. They named her Sarah, after the grandmother who would never hold her but whose love had helped shape the woman who would raise her. As Clara held her daughter for the first time, surrounded by Wyatt's gentle strength and Maria's happy tears, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The auction block seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare that had ultimately led to the most beautiful dream she could have imagined. Emma had chosen to keep her own baby, and with Clara and Wyatt's support, she had married a young rancher from the next county who loved her completely and accepted her child as his own. "You taught me that the past doesn't have to define the future," Emma had written in her thank you letter. "You showed me what real love looks like." Outside the bedroom window, the prairie stretched endless toward the mountains, and Clara could see Wyatt's ranch hands moving cattle in the distance. The sign over the gate read, "Callahan Family Ranch," and now there truly was a family to justify the name. Clara looked down at her daughter's perfect face and whispered the same words her own mother had spoken to her so many years ago. "Beauty isn't what people see on the outside, my darling. It's what lives in here." She placed her hand gently over the baby's heart. "And you, my beautiful girl, are going to light up the world." Through the window, the sun climbed higher over the prairie that had become home, and Clara Callahan, once the ugliest bride in town, now the mother of the most beautiful baby in the territory, smiled with the deep contentment of a woman who had discovered that love, like prairie grass, could survive any storm and emerge stronger than ever. The silver locket at her throat caught the morning light, and Clara touched it gently, carrying her mother's love forward into the next generation. Some stories, she realized, had endings that were really beginnings, and some auctions resulted in purchases that turned out to be priceless beyond measure.